The Fallout series has introduced us to many factions that can be considered pure evil, some filled with horrors, monsters, and mutants. And when the chain of cruelty begins, it can only end in one way. So today we are going all the way from raiders to even super mutant supremacists, unraveling the most disturbing factions in Fallout. 1. Fanatics. In the ruins of Pittsburgh, now known as the Pit, the survivors of the Great War would suffer from a mysterious illness called the troglodyte degeneration contagion, which affected about 20% of their population. This contagion would mutate the infected into feral monstrosities, who would roam the ruins and underground, hiding from the light and only coming out at night. Similar to mythological ghouls, trogs would flood the streets in the darkness of night. And since they were much faster than the average human, every survivor would be forced to pick a faction so they could find strength in numbers. Most of the city has been overrun by these trogs, and this would be a constant struggle that would strain even the strongest factions. The Pit was heavily nuked during the final hours of the Great War, as China wanted to cripple America's steel production and hinder whatever reconstruction efforts might have been possible in a post-nuclear war America. This would result in heavy radiation overtaking most of the city, which combined with chemical runoff from the largely unregulated industrial system to subject the surviving civilian population to horrors not experienced in most other regions in the setting. A faction would form in the outskirts of the city, the Fanatics, who under a mysterious and unnamed leader would arise and unite every last one of the Pit's raider groups under one overarching banner. With their combined numbers and supplies, they became the dominant faction, as their members gradually tightened their control over the city through sheer force. The Fanatics united would be able to fight off the Trogs and continue to take ground. Much like Caesar's Legion, factions who did not bend the knee and accept being absorbed into the Fanatics were either butchered or enslaved. The Fanatics maintained their numbers through this brute force. Joining them was not always a choice. Wastelanders who were targeted for recruitment were presented with a simple ultimatum: join or their families would be killed without mercy. Though at the end of the day, their families were still slaughtered, leaving recruits to believe they are beyond salvation as they became part of the very people who gave them the cruel choice, doing as they had done and continuing the cycle. Recruits that could not or would not fight were either enslaved or subjected to torture. The minority would only use torture as a means to encourage obedience, though the majority found entertainment in the practice and sought new and creative ways to brutalize their victims. The Fanatics lived by the principle that might makes right, and they're made up of several subfactions that are known to fight amongst themselves to rise through the ranks. Amongst the Fanatics, the authority of these subfactions are mostly dependent on what the individual groups had accomplished. The Fanatics survive solely off the suffering of others, as they lack all basic survival skills, and each individual group within the Fanatics is responsible for their own survival. They would continue to absorb smaller gangs and amass their numbers, taking more ground within that would eventually bring them to the attention of the dominant faction in the Pit at the time, the Union, who were made up of remnants from the local 42 Pittsburgh Union Steel Company that recruited like-minded civilians who wanted to reestablish civilization within the Pit. Though the Union sought coexistence, they would establish a territorial border that they had hoped would maintain peace between the two factions. Their leader used this barbaric confederation to encourage their members to target the only faction that has managed to survive their wrath, the Union, as they were the last and only true threat left for the Fanatics in the region. While the Union had supplies, a steel refinery, and a weapons mill, the Fanatics had manpower and a complete disregard for the lives of others. They would also hire the Hellcat mercenaries to aid them in their fight against the Union. Though friendly fire was common, and the mercenaries would prove their worth and further all Fanatic gains. This would lead to an overwhelming Fanatic victory that would vastly reduce Union hold over the city in an event known as Bloody Thursday. On Blood Thursday, the Union would lose both the steel refinery and weapons mill to the Fanatics. In one day, this had been the largest single defeat that the Union suffered. Though the Fanatics would not be able to fully utilize the foundry for steel production, as they did not have the same training that the Union members received. Instead, they would use it for the production of power chemical weapons, though periodically production would be hampered with the introduction of the Vault 76 dwellers to the Pit. They would test these weapons on their slaves, viewing them as expendable. By the time the Vault 76 dwellers arrived in the Pit, the Union had been pushed back to a fortified district known as the Pen until the day that they could take back their territory from the Fanatics, though that day would never come, as nightly Trog attacks would reduce their numbers greatly, and the fanatics would eventually overtake them, enslaving all survivors who were unable to flee to the Appalachian wasteland. And this would establish a regime of brutal dictators that would last for over 150 years. By the time that the Brotherhood of Steel arrived at the pit in 2025, the fanatics had turned on themselves, and the pit had devolved into an anarchic hellhole. The same illness that created the Trogs consuming the minds of many who had not undergone the mutation, becoming the Wildmen. The Trogs and Wildmen threat had become so brutal that the last pockets of survivors had taken to the rooftops of the city. In an event known as the Scourge, the elder of the East Coast Brotherhood of Steel, Owen Lyons, would order an attack on the fanatics, which resulted in most of the pit's population being killed off. Lyons would order a sweep from the west to the east of the ruined city, although his forces were outnumbered. The Brotherhood's superior technology and organization gave them the upper hand. Under Lyons' orders, the Brotherhood exterminated anything that came their way and salvaged any technology they could take. Anything they couldn't, they would destroy, so it could never be used to cause harm again. During the siege, an explosion would rock the foundry and result in a Brotherhood knight by the name of Ishmael Asher being buried under the rubble of the mill. The Brotherhood assumed him to be dead, a mistake that would lead to the pit's quick devolution from the relatively safe place the Brotherhood had made before they left, with any healthy child that they could find to be trained as the future of the East Coast Brotherhood of Steel. Asher would survive in his power armor and use it to seize control of the pit, and utilizing his wit to establish himself as leader to the few surviving raiders of the pit, filling the power vacuum. Asher saw promise there, hoping to restore the pit into the industrialized city that it had once been. Though the population was far too low for his goals to be accomplished, he would recruit and enslave any he could to begin his plans. He would rebuild the steel mill and use it to produce ammo that would bring wealth to the pit's new leadership. The pit would become strong, gradually rebuilding as more raiders joined and slaves were purchased from Paradise Falls in the capital wasteland. Eventually, Asher would marry a scientist by the name of Sandra, and the two would genuinely love one another, having a daughter named Marie who showed complete immunity to the troglodyte degeneration contagion. Marie's blood would be used to cure the people of the pit, though rather this happened after Asher's empire had this dismantled, or as he completed his plans is up to the actions of the lone wanderer from Vault 101. The death of the Master left many super mutants without a place in the world, hated by many and untrusted by most. They would carry the burdens left on them from the Master and hope to find a place where they could finally find comfort. But there are many who could never fully forgive humanity for destroying the Master and the cruelty they were subjected to in the years following, birthing many groups that would reap their toll upon the wasteland. One such group is the next faction. 2. State of Utubitha. In the Mojave Wasteland, there is a growing army of super mutants seeking to return to the ways of the super mutant master and wage war against humanity. Though this time, it would not be to bring unity, this time it would be for revenge. Your first encounter with the state of Utubitha and their leader, Tabitha, will most likely be through her radio station, which is situated on the top of Black Mountain. Prior to the war, Black Mountain was the site of a powerful military communications array and monitoring station, and used to spy on China's satellite network to gain intelligence on Chinese troop deployments and attack plans. Due to its mountaintop location, it remained largely intact after the climax of the Great War, though it would become heavily irradiated over time. It would remain this way until the Broken Hills uranium mine ran dry, leaving the mutants and humans to disperse throughout the California wasteland. Many super mutants would head to the Mojave, where they hoped to find peace amongst its people, as they were largely unaffected by the super mutant's former master and may have less prejudice towards their kind. One such super mutant was Marcus, who had previously taken part in the destruction of the Enclave oil rig alongside the Chosen One of Fallout 2. He would discover Black Mountain and use its communication system to create a broadcast station to attract like-minded super mutants so that they could form a community. The Brotherhood of Steel would become aware of their existence but sought to leave them be, as they hadn't been hostile and sought only peace. This would not last long, for as the community continued to grow, so would the population of second-generation super mutants that are far less logically minded than their first-generation counterparts. The second generation and the many of the Master's former elite super mutant shock troopers, the Nightkin, would come to disregard Marcus's message of coexistence and begin to listen to a new voice, that of Nightkin named Tabitha. Tabitha preached that they could return to the relaxing times that they had before the fall of the super mutant master, where they would be accepted and not have to worry about the NCR or the Legion attacking them simply for being different. Tabitha's faction would begin to attack any human that would approach Black Mountain, This was the breaking point for Marcus Marcus, and most of the first-generation super mutants would leave to form a super mutant community of Jacobstown to the northwest, where ghouls and humans were welcomed just as things had been in the Broken Hills. This would leave Tabitha without anyone to keep her in check, leaving her to continue to build up her super mutant army and turn Black Mountain into a fortress that could be defended against any and all non-mutant outsiders, including the NCR and Caesar's Legion. She would convince the Nightkin and second-generation super mutants that she was a prophet of the Master, using her newfound power to form the state of Utabitha. No longer would the radio station seek to attract super mutants to find safety in isolation. Now they would use the species' superiority to attract the most vicious of super mutants to join them. Tabitha would order her followers to attack humans on sight, leading travelers along the Long 15 to complain to the NCR Rangers that their caravans were increasingly being attacked by the super mutants of Black Mountain, though the Rangers could not focus their efforts away from the NCR's continued war with the Legion. Any and all respect that the Brotherhood had for the super mutants living there would be lost, considering all technology stored at Black Mountain to be fair game that they would retrieve in due time. Tabitha would hallucinate new threats on a regular basis, believing them to be visions granted to her by the Master, further increasing the hostilities between her faction and the outside world. Ghouls and super mutants had gotten along in the past, leading a ghoul by the name of Raul Tejada to attempt to gain work there to help further restore the radio station. This would turn out horrible for him, as he would be imprisoned and constantly threatened with execution. But Raul would use his keen intellect to disable Tabitha's most trusted friend and advisor, a Mr. Handy that had been her companion for many years. The courier would find that entering Black Mountain through the easiest routes would lead to an immediate conflict that they could not back down from, ending with Tabitha's death. If the courier chooses to stealthily ascend the hard-to-reach areas of the mountain, they could fix Rhonda and turn all the super mutants their friendly, forever changing their ways. Tabitha would free Raul into the service of the courier, when Tabitha and Rhonda would continue their journey back east, where their exploits would be compiled and published into a popular children's story. Any super mutants attracted by the radio broadcast would instead find nothing, wandering the wasteland until they were guided peacefully to Jacobstown, where Marcus's community would thrive. 3. White Glove Society. Prior to the culmination of the Great War, Robert House, a wealthy businessman and founder of RobCo, would construct a missile defense system around the Las Vegas Strip, and that would spare much of Vegas and its inhabitants from the same level of destruction that took place all over the globe. House did this so that he could one day return to make the Strip his domain and reset humanity on a new path after the war that he hoped would allow him to bring new life to the world and usher in a new golden age for humanity. Mr. House knew that in order to do this, he would have to wait until humanity had become more of a clean slate, and like clay, he could mold it into a shape that would allow his plans to come to fruition. He would awaken from a sleep-like hibernation around 200 years later and send his robotic army of Securitrons out to secure Vegas under his control. His robots would uncover that Vegas was not empty and that many of the civilians that had been saved from the harshness of the nuclear bombardments had devolved into warring tribes that built their own territories within the Strip. This wouldn't do. But Mr. House knew that he would need the aid of as many of these tribes as he could in order to rebuild and repopulate Vegas. He would establish communication with these tribes and attempt to win over their loyalty in exchange for many of the resources he had stockpiled for his return. Most of these tribes resisted his army of robots, leaving a mere 3 that had agreed to Mr. House's terms, and joined him in restoring Vegas, which would take on the name New Vegas to mark this new era of humanity that they had built together. Of these tribes was one whose original name would be forgotten. Now known as the White Glove Society, they were among the cruelest and inhuman of the tribes, viewing other humans as mere meat that they could harvest. In this new society, House would mold them into a faction that would mostly abandon their old ways, choosing to focus on entertaining and perfecting the art of showmanship. While House's Securitrons and the tribes loyal to him had begun to rebuild the Strip, smaller groups of locals would erect a wall around the Strip, which would separate the restored sections of the Strip from the areas that they had yet to rebuild. By the time the NCR's scouts had discovered that the Hoover Dam in the Mojave Wasteland was almost completely spared the ravages of the Great War and the last 200 years, Aaron Kimball, president of the NCR, would order the NCR Army to secure the dam and bring it back to operational status. This would prove more difficult than they would expect, as when the NCR's forces arrived at the dam, they were greeted by Mr. House's well-armed tribals and Securitrons. In order to negotiate the security and independence of New Vegas, House agreed to surrender his claim to the Hoover Dam in a pact that would become known as the Treaty of New Vegas. Little did Mr. House know, the outwardly grateful tribals that he had delivered into a life of luxury had not been as content as they had seemed in their new roles. Though House had arranged for the White Glove Society to take over the prestigious Ultralux Casino and receive the finest meats that the wasteland had to offer from the Brahmin barons of the Long 15, many of their tribesmen had not forgotten the taste of human flesh and craved to consume it once more. Mortimer, who was the right hand of the White Glove Society's leader Marjorie, would send those loyal to him to capture a human that they could serve to the patrons of the White Glove Society and restore the traditions that had been forgotten without the leader's permission. They would mistakenly capture the son of a powerful and influential Brahmin baron named Heck Gunderson, where they would lock him up in their kitchen and prepare him to be served. Heck Gunderson would ask the courier for his assistance in locating his son, a task made easier by rumors that hinted at what the White Glove Society had been before the reunification of Vegas. Heck Gunderson had hired an investigator that would join the courier in uncovering this secret. Together, they would infiltrate the dinner with the aid of Marjorie, who agreed to sponsor them joining the event that she did not know that Mortimer had manipulated into a cannibal dinner. The courier would sneak into the kitchen and drug the wine that would be served at the event, causing the members of the White Glove Society to be knocked out during the event's toasting ceremony. From there, they would rescue Ted from his confinement and escort him to the members-only section, where they would expose Mortimer for his crimes. Curious enough, if the courier asks Mr. House if he is aware that the White Glove Society used to be cannibals, House says that he is indeed, and that their contract had required them to put an end to those dietary practices. If he is told that the White Glove Society has resumed eating people again, he will consider it a breach of that contract and allow the courier to do as he pleases with them. From there, it aligns with what we saw in the television series, that he massacred the whole of the White Glove Society in order to prevent them from ever going back to their cannibalistic ways again, though they could also have split apart after Mortimer was exposed, leaving the Ultralux with their reputation destroyed. This last faction puts even the most horrific of cannibals to shame as they cook their victims alive just to watch them burn. 4. The Forged. The Forged are a massive raider group known for their brutality. Their leader Slag was quick to purge their ranks of anyone he viewed as weak. Before joining, their members would be subjected to a series of trials, and if they had failed any part of the trial, including the name change that would reflect on the forging process, they would be tortured and killed. Slag would be known to show no mercy for his underlings. Those that failed in their duties were mutilated, branded, and often burned alive. Those who cried out in pain would be punished with amputation and exile, and leaving survivors or fleeing from enemies would result in branding, exile, or death as well. Slag arrived shortly before the emergence of the sole survivor, with a small force from outside the Commonwealth, and sought to fill the power vacuum that had been left following the collapse of the Minutemen, though this was not an easy task. Slag was obsessed with fire and the forging process, and sought to mold his group into a weapon that could conquer the wasteland. They would set up shop in the Saugus Ironworks and fortify it to fit their needs, adorning the outside with the bodies of their victims. When they first arrived at the Commonwealth, their growth was slow, as many of the recruits died during the harsh trials they required all initiates to take part in. Though no exact details would be given as to what these trials entailed, it is revealed that they are required to change their names at some point in the process. Slag feared that the natives of the Commonwealth were far too weak to join the Forged and considered starting up elsewhere. Until he discovered the Gunners, he would offer them the chance to prove themselves within his ranks, and many of the Gunners would join the Forged, passing the trials and bolstering their ranks. The theft of their members would push the two factions into a brutal and bloody war, though negotiations would eventually be reached and put an end to the conflict. With the Forged reaching an uneasy truce with the Gunners, raiders from all over would seek them out and proceed through their trials, establishing their hold over the territory. Over time, they would experience a shortage of scrap iron that would be acquired to continue their operations in the ironworks, which they used to forge both weapons and ammunition. Slag would order one of his most trusted underlings, Bedlam, to secure the Dunwich Borers marble mine and scrap the metals found there. At Dunwich Borers, they would capture many Wastelanders and burn them alive, much to the amusement of their numbers. This appeared to be one of their favorite forms of execution, much as their members often donned flame-resistant suits and wielded flame-type weapons. Slag would comment on his terminal if other raider groups had been destroyed, noting that they were too weak, and he would like to see their remaining numbers undergo the trials of the Forged. Upon the Enclave's arrival in the Commonwealth wasteland, the Forged would acquire acquire much of their technology through conflict against them, pitting the two factions in a bloody war. This would give the Forged access to heavy incinerators and even a suit of Hellfire power armor. Their downfall would come at the sole survivor's hands, who would be tasked by Preston Garvey to visit Abraham Finch at his farm. There, Abraham explains the Forged to the sole survivor, their threat to the wasteland, and that his son Jake stole their family's heirloom sword and was seeking to join their hands. He and his wife will beg the sole survivor to retrieve the sword and rescue their son. From there, the sole survivor will make his way to the ironworks and fight his way into the blast furnace room, where he will find Jack and Slag, who is wearing a full suit of leveled power armor as well as wielding the heirloom sword, which turns out to be a shish kebab. Slag is impressed that the sole survivor had made it that far, but demands that either Jake kills a prisoner or face death himself. Slag is not alone, and if Jake refuses, a brawl ensues, with the sole survivor coming to his aid and putting an end to Slag's reign of terror, alongside the final leaders left alive if Dunwich Borers had already been destroyed. Without Bedlam and Slag, the Forged turns on each other and dissolves entirely. One thing that these factions have in common is that with all of them, their leaders would rise through a vacuum that allowed them to exploit those desperate for structure and security in numbers. These leaders had the opportunity to bring real order and justice to the wasteland, though all they would establish is cruelty that would bring death upon the wasteland in numbers untold. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happened to the most evil companies in Fallout, click the video on the screen.